Every once in a while, people of African descent try to connect with information concerning our history. Depending on who we talk to, our history takes on new characteristics or narratives that may have sprinkles of truth in them, but still misses the mark. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and our desire to know who we are has stripped us of a proper historical perspective in many ways. So today, I thought I would bring it back to square one and explain our story in a way we might all understand. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and supporting this content. If you'd like access to full courses and sources, or you simply want to show your support, you may do so by clicking the Patreon link in the description box below. Over the years, I've encountered so many people in the diaspora who really don't understand our history, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, as we're all on a journey to learn. It only becomes a problem when we attempt to create new identities based on false or simply misguided information. Oftentimes, the blind spots of our history allows for elaborate explanations or straight up romanticism. We make a simple history very complicated because at times we don't want to be associated with the doom and gloom of the past. However, I think in the opposite way. A true understanding of our history or our story not only humanizes our ancestors but makes the history far less intimidating and confusing. The truth is not something to shy away from, but it's something to be understood. To begin, one of the most common fallacies I've been hearing all my life, and what I continue to hear even today, is the idea that we in the diaspora have no idea what tribe we come from. This statement is a fallacy because it promotes the idea that we descend exclusively from one African ethnic group, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The undercurrent of that statement can sometimes be nefarious because it suggests that since we can't identify a singular ethnic group from which we may have come from, there is no use in trying to connect with our roots or the African continent in general. Now, here is the proper historical lens. Over time, the transatlantic slave trade received Africans from all over West and Central Africa and a few from Southeast Africa and Mozambique. But the overwhelming majority of enslaved people were from various African ethnic groups from West and Central Africa. Oftentimes, in order to discourage revolts on slave ships, Europeans would purposely mix and mingle Africans who spoke different languages so they wouldn't be able to communicate. And those who survived this perilous journey would then end up either in the Caribbean or the Americas. Later, their children would then begin to speak the language of whatever European nation colonized the region. So for example, no slave driver or nation ever said, "We want only Yorubas in the Caribbean and Bakongo in the Americas." If that were the case, our story would be very different. On another note, it's just unrealistic for enslaved Africans to have only interacted and have children with individuals in their own ethnic group once they arrived in the Americas or the Caribbean. That would have been nearly impossible because they were surrounded by other Africans who originated from different ethnic groups and regions entirely. So we have to be very careful about the statements we make and promote because it may not reflect a proper historical lens. Another statement I often hear, and one that I've been hearing my entire life, is the idea that Africans sold us into slavery. This is another one that can be used in a nefarious way because it also suggests that we should forget about Africa. And in a sense, the people that are there today are the bad guys, if you will, and can't be trusted. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, I've actually spoken about this. The history concerning the inner workings of the slave trade specifically is far more complex than we think. Anyone who promotes the simplistic idea that Africans sold us into slavery is really disregarding context. First, let's try and understand what they are trying to say when they make that statement. When someone says Africans sold us into slavery, they're suggesting that sometimes without even knowing that Africans all across West and Central Africa all ganged up on our ancestors and sold them into slavery. That there is a clear distinction between us and them. The problem with this logic is that it borrows from the previous fallacy concerning the idea that we descend from one singular ethnic group. The truth is far more complex than that, and one that was never really taught to us. Once you begin to actually study the history, you quickly begin to realize that we in the diaspora are the descendants of victims and victimizers. The Atlantic slave trade was very chaotic. At one moment, you can be an enslaver selling your war captives to a Portuguese ship, and then the very next day, you yourself can be enslaved. The reason for this is simple. Africa in general is a very diverse continent with thousands of different people who never identified with one another because they spoke different languages and had different religions and cultures. There was no Pan-African identity in the continent in those times, or ever for that matter. In West Africa, for example, once the larger empires of Mali and Songhai fell, various ethnic groups were now free to advance their own expansionist agendas, and the fall of the larger empires which kept other ethnic groups in place created a period of warring hybrid kingdoms who wanted to gain a stronghold over the region. They attempted to do this by creating wealth. One of the ways of creating wealth, so they thought, was through selling war captives to Europeans along the coast. Now, via hindsight, it was simply an unequal exchange. Each kingdom with different ethnic groups would compete against each other to acquire wealth and attempt to expand, and those kingdoms that refused to sell enslaved people to Europeans would just be victims of the African kingdoms who would. So one day, Kingdom A can be doing the majority of the slave raiding, and Kingdom B retaliates in an attempt to survive, not only economically but also physically, and they proceed to do slave raids on Kingdom A. Those victims over time from Kingdom A and Kingdom B, i.e., our ancestors, would not simply be victims of Kingdom A, they would be descended from victims and victimizers of both kingdoms, A and B, both of which comprise of different ethnic groups. To give you a concrete reference, I like to use the example of Ayuba Diallo, the Fulani man from Senegal who was on his way to sell his Mandinka or Mande captive, and ironically got captured by the Mandinka himself and sold into slavery. In essence, Ayuba Diallo was the victimizer, but very quickly became the victim. His case isn't unusual because countless African people throughout West and Central Africa participated in slave raiding and then in a moment became enslaved. Another example I like to give is the Kingdom of Dahomey. The people of Dahomey for a very long time were oppressed by the Yoruba state of Oyo. The Yoruba would raid their region and enslave any person they could find, including women and children. The Kingdom of Dahomey, ironically, was greatly advanced during this time as they began resisting. For example, you only became a king in Dahomey because of your prowess in war. This speaks volumes concerning the condition they were in as a people. In fact, one of the many reasons why the legendary Mino, or so-called Dahomey Amazons, grew in number was because of the woman's desire to protect her children from slave raids. In many ways, Dahomey can be seen as a state of victims until they rose up and became one of the most brutal victimizers in slave trading history. They certainly got their revenge on the Yoruba people who were located in Benin. In fact, many of the Yorubas who were enslaved in Brazil were there because of the state of Dahomey. Given this historical fact, it's obvious that many people in the diaspora descend from both the Yoruba and the Fon people of Dahomey, both of which are victims and victimizers. If we study the Atlantic slave trade from a proper historical perspective, it becomes far more complex, leaving little to no room for absolute statements. But anyway, the point of this was to give you guys a more foundational understanding into our history so that you can use it as a format for your own studies. Context is important, and we have to be able to pull from it, especially when trying to understand our story. Well, I'm all out, guys. If you like these videos and want to help in its continued production, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.